A lot had changed since I started out. Back then, the only thing that mattered was flying. That's me, Slayton. Major Donald Kay. My friends call me Deke. Going faster, farther, higher was all we cared about. 10 years had passed. Now it was 1967. The moon was the center of my life. And right then it felt pretty damn close. Down on pad 34, the moon rocket was ready for its first flight. Pad 34. Man, if this place could talk.
You remember the time on your flight when you said you didn't want to ride down to the pad? We were doing some kind of a test. You didn't want to ride down to the pad in that old cattle car we had. So you took the vet down with the top down. You had the little walk-around ventilator.
Old stories still being told. These guys remember. Some of my good buddies. Scotty, John, Gordo, and old Al. Alan B. Shepard, America's first man in space. He and I were the only ones from that first group to see it all.
What do you remember about Gus? What do you want Gus? You gotta say something about Gus here.
Gus was a man of few words, but you could hang your hat on anything he said.
Gus, what do you think your chances are for an Apollo flight?
I think they're pretty good. I expect to be around for most of the Apollo program.
You think you will one day make one of the trips to the moon, then?
I'm planning on it.
Gus Grissom. Not much on water skis, but a hell of a pilot and a damn good engineer. He liked to have a good time as much as the rest of us. But when it came to work, there was an intensity you could cut with a knife.
Gus was a charger. He was a very macho type. He was really the typical test pilot. But he also had go fever. You know, he wanted to get it going. He wanted to get up there and do the job.
Gus was our second man in space, and he flew a perfect mission. But that wasn't what people remembered. What they remembered was he'd lost his ship.
And somehow Gus got tagged with making a mistake because he lost the spacecraft, and you were not allowed a mistake.
Did I feel that I was in danger at any time during the flight or in the water? Well, I was scared a good portion of the time. I guess this is a pretty good indication.
You were what?
Scared. Okay?
Test pilots lose planes, it happens. But this wasn't the test pilot business anymore. This was the astronaut business. When it goes right, you get a parade and a trip to the White House. When it goes wrong, you get a reputation.
It hurt him very, very much. It's very easy to blame the astronaut, but that wasn't Gus. Gus was much too great an engineer and too serious a pilot.
He got tagged as the astronaut who'd lost his ship. Gus hated the reputation, but he didn't run away from it. He stuck it right in everybody's face. On his next flight, he named his spacecraft the Unsinkable Molly Brown.
Gus was very intense, very, very intense about the problem he had with his Mercury flight, very intense about sort of disappearing out of the system. So he made his Gemini flight a perfect Gemini flight.
This time the ending was perfect too. After splashdown, he got seasick, puked his guts out, but he wouldn't open that hatch until the chopper had a firm grip on the capsule. He'd made his point. Gus wanted that first Apollo ride. Now he would get it. Apollo, a moon ship for a 500,000-mile journey. The most impressive flying machine ever built. It made the Mercuries and Geminis we'd been flying look like something from the Wright brothers. This was probably the most complex thing ever put together by humans. as much technology as a nuclear submarine crammed into a package the size of a minivan. The electrical system alone had 30 miles of wire.
I'm real pleased to be on the first flight, looking forward to it. I just now started getting into the Apollo systems and looking at Apollo spacecraft and trying to forget everything I knew about Gemini. I think we've got a real good crew with Ed and Roger.
Ed White was the best athlete in the astronaut corps and the first American to walk in space. A real mom and apple pie type. After John Glenn left the program, Ed stepped right into his shoes.
I had a great faith in the people and the equipment that we were using for the mission. I had a great faith in myself, and especially in Jim. And also, I think I had a great faith in my own God.
I remember after his flight, he insisted on putting in his life personal contract story the question of how did you feel when you got out on the first spacewalk? And he told the life reporter, I felt red, white, and blue all over. And I went to Ed and I said, come on, Ed, we're all patriotic, but that's bullshit. He said, nope, that stays. I feel like $1 million. Just like that. That's the way I felt.
Roger Chaffee had flown a U-2 over Cuba during the missile crisis. He took the pictures of the Russian rockets Kennedy showed on TV. Apollo 1 would be his first space flight. There was a lot to learn, and not enough hours in the day to learn it, but there was no time to slow down. We were on a roll. On top of that, there was always the Russians. They were never far from our thoughts.
We had a general idea what the Soviets were doing. But I don't know, do you ever remember getting a briefing with anybody in the CIA that would give us an inkling as to what the Soviets were doing back in those days?
No, I think
we knew that they were planning to go to the moon. We had satellite photographs at that time that showed us the development of their launch stand. Then they also showed us the vehicle as it was brought into position.
The Russians weren't the only pressure. We'd been keeping our heads down since 1959, eating, sleeping, breathing spaceflight. While we weren't looking, America had changed.
Worst race riots since those 2 years ago in the...
While we'd been trying to figure out how to join spacecraft together, the country was figuring out how to tear itself apart. A lot of our friends were fighter pilots, and they were starting to get shot down over a place called Vietnam. President Johnson was feeling the heat. He thought it was about time America got some good news. He looked around, and NASA seemed like a pretty good messenger.
Everybody had go fever, meaning we've got to go, we've got to keep up with the schedule, we've got to get to the moon and back before the end of this decade. We're on a timeline. We've got to do these things in this order. If we don't do them right now in this order, we're going to lose our place. We'll slip the launch.
We were only too eager to deliver. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that shiny new moon ship. So far, the Apollo 1 spacecraft looked a hell of a lot better than it performed.
The spacecraft had been delivered, but of course we had lived with it for many, many months before at the contractor's plant, North American Rockwell. And we knew that the spacecraft was, in poor shape relative to what it ought to be. We felt like we could fly it, but let's face it, it just wasn't as good as it should have been for the job of flying the first manned Apollo mission.
We were dealing with new contractors who had their own ideas on how they were going to do things. All of the history of Mercury and Gemini was put aside, and the knowledge of the people that got us that far was also put aside. You don't throw your history away, you learn from it, and that's when I called it Project Appalling.
Late January, 4 weeks to launch. We were working around the clock, testing system by system.
We were going very fast. NASA were behind schedule as always. And we were running tests without taking time to really look at the data.
The last check was called the plugs out test, a full dress rehearsal for launch. It was a Friday at the end of an awfully long week, and we were tired. We all had our eyes on the weekend.
In the morning when the crew came in to the office, I sensed something. I don't know what it was that I sensed, but I picked up something from all three of them. There was a quietness about them. Instead of being ready for a test where they usually just get up and bounce out the door, it was something they didn't want to do. Their attitude was 180 from anything I've ever seen before.
It would be actual flight conditions. Crew in full suits, capsule under its own power, 100% oxygen inside, and the hatch sealed.
It's not a normal workday. You stayed there till the test was done, which meant that you might be in that spacecraft 18, 20 hours. It was a long, arduous test.
This one was no different. We'd been going since 6 in the morning.
I said to Gus, if it doesn't check out well, if you have a glitch or an anomaly, get the hell out of there.
Hell, he wasn't going to do that. That would have brought the program to a stop, and everybody said, well, that chicken shit guy and all that kind of stuff.
You've got a cast of thousands geared up to perform a test, and you're critical to that test, and here you are, you've worked all day long, and you're down to the last half hour, last hour. It's very difficult to just say, hey, I'm putting everything to a stop here.
I was in the blockhouse with Stu Russo, late Friday afternoon.
We had some communication problems. We were having trouble. We were testing out the various loops and radios.
Okay, we're ready to pick up, Chuck, but all I can do is give it a try. You copy? No, I don't read you at all, Chuck. You want to try the phone? Hey guys, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings? I can't hear a thing you're saying. Did you guys say something from the command module? I said, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings?
The test was dragging on, one glitch after another. Most of us had already called to say we wouldn't be home for dinner. And then it happened. Down under Gus's seat, somewhere in 30 miles of wire, there was a short circuit. In the blockhouse, all we saw was another glitch on the meter. Nobody knew it then, but a spark had jumped out. It landed and sat there, in the pure oxygen. At 15 pounds pressure, it glowed, brighter and brighter.
3, 2, 1, mark. You're cleared for launch.
And then it went, like a blowtorch. I called for medics and raced over to the pad. The radio was dead, but I still hadn't given up on the crew. In their suits, I figured maybe they still had a chance. The pad guys were burning their hands trying to get the damn hatch off, choking in toxic smoke. Almost as fast as it started, the fire was out. Finally, they got the hatch off. And then we knew.
Most of their suits were still white. You did not look in and see charred bodies.
We always expected to lose someone, someday, but not on the ground. That was not a way to die, not for a test pilot. The moon that had seemed so close now had vanished from sight.
Early in the morning, I got in a T-38 and flew to the Cape, and I never will forget that flight.
Within hours of the fire, we had put Frank Borman in charge of our investigation.
All along the way, the controllers were saying, you know, we're sorry and this and that. To me, that portrayed the whole feeling of the country. It was an enormous setback, and everybody felt it.
I mean, we were really shocked because we had just left the guys, we'd come back,
and none of us could talk. I mean, we just kind of looked at each other. Eyes were full of pain.
Devastating to the people in the program. I mean, just devastating. I mean, it sent a wave of pain.
Oh, I'll never forget the pain in Al Shepard's eyes and his face. I'll never forget
When I got home, boy, I lost it all. That was a very traumatic experience. You know, you kept going, what could I have done? What could we have done?
Gus was one of the 7. I mean, there was a bonding there that they had, no matter whatever happened.
The 7 original astronauts were now 6.
I think the American public is mature enough to recognize that it's an important program. It's a program that must go on. And if something should happen, why, well, it happened. We still have to go on living every day, and we go on and continue the program.
I remember that Max Faget and Deke Slayton and I, we were at the Cape for the investigation. We went out one night and got bombed. I'm not proud to say, I don't drink anymore, but we got bombed that night. Ended up throwing glasses like a scene out of an old World War I movie. But then the next day, that was it.
It was back to work, on a new and painful job. How could it have happened? Everybody put aside what they'd been doing and started looking for answers. But as soon as we stopped and looked at what we'd been doing, really looked, the answers were suddenly very clear.
We had crap in that spacecraft that wouldn't quit. It had a big sponge foam pad, highly combustible. We had Velcro. The thing was wallpapered with Velcro, with an adhesive that was highly flammable and toxic. Everything was wrong. Everything was wrong.
We put 100% oxygen into that vehicle and then pressurized it. Now, we'd done that all through Gemini, all through Mercury, and we were doing that in Apollo. And nobody stood up and said, hey, you guys know what you got when you pressurize 100% oxygen? You got a bomb sitting there.
Sure, we took risks. It's part of the job. You don't always know how it'll turn out. But there was something else. The insane work schedule. The disease we called Go Fever.
We'd gotten too much of a goddamn hurry. We were willing to put up with a lot of poor hardware and poor preparation in order to try to get on with the job, and a lot of us knew that we were doing that.
That time frame was the worst I can remember. I was grounded, Shepard was grounded, and now the whole damn space program was grounded. I was miserable, but Al was worse, and he took it out on everybody.
I was just mad at the world. I rapidly became known as the icy commander with not too much allowance for mistakes or frivolity or lack of performance among the astronauts.
I'm sure the American public will greatly appreciate seeing the real Alan Shepard.
I remember he'd walk into the astronaut office and he'd walk in with his briefcase and slam it down on a desk, and the other astronauts would be sitting in the room and they'd well, he's in that kind of a mood today.
We had an arrangement with Lola Morrow that have her put on the door a smiling owl or a very steely-eyed owl, a picture.
Many times the guys wouldn't even make it by the secretary's desk. They just take one look at the picture, turn around, and leave the icy commander to his own devices.
I can remember a time or two when I was walking down the hall and I saw Al coming out, and I'd break off into another hallway and go around.
On the 6th anniversary of his Mercury flight, we threw a party, put a little movie together to remind him of his flight status.
Only two had gone before, fellow pioneers into the unknown, Ham and Enos. Al studied their training procedures. He utilized their proven medical staff.
And I had thought briefly about getting up and interrupting at the microphone, but all of a sudden I realized there were two guys standing behind me, each of them weighed about 250 pounds, and there was no way that Shepard was going to get out of that chair.
Good old Al. 6 years an astronaut, 15 minutes in space. He got the message. The icy commander loosened up. But that didn't make time go any faster. The new spacecraft was still a year away. And the Russians were up to something. The biggest rocket ever launched, capable of reaching the moon. All we knew at the time was that it had gone into Earth orbit. The pilot was named Vladimir Komarov. After it was all over, we learned the full story. His spacecraft started spinning out of control. The ground crew did all they could, but it was no use. They knew he wasn't going to make it. Premier Kosygin told him he'd get a hero's burial. And they got his wife on the radio to say goodbye. But he said he wasn't ready to die just yet. He fought the controls, and against all odds, he managed to re-enter safely. The chute popped out right on schedule. But just when it looked like he'd made it, that chute got twisted up like a washcloth being wrung out. It never opened. They kept their promise. They buried him a hero.
We are very saddened by the loss of Colonel Komarov. We feel comradeship for this test pilot because we've met several of his fellow cosmonauts.
I couldn't escape the irony. Both sides racing forward at breakneck speed, both stumbling at the same moment. The only question now was, who'd get up first?
And his fellow cosmonauts.
October 1968, 21 months since the fire. Apollo was ready to try again. Sitting on the Saturn rocket was the brand new spacecraft.
We felt like the spacecraft that we were going to fly was such a difference and a marked change and an upgrade from what had essentially killed Gus and Roger and Ed, that we were very pleased. I mean, we thought we had a wonderful flying machine, and all we had to do was to go out and prove that, in fact, that it was a wonderful flying machine.
Apollo 7 was ready. The commander would be one of the original Mercury astronauts. The program's rebirth was riding on his shoulders. The stage was set for the return of Wally Schirra.
I had fun with Mercury. I had fun with Gemini. I lose a buddy, my next-door neighbor, Gus, one of our 7. I lose 2 other guys I thought the world of. And I began to realize this was no longer fun. I was now assigned a mission where I had to put it back on track, like Humpty Dumpty.
Everyone felt the change. The old Wally loved to joke around. The new Wally was dead serious. He wanted to keep the mission simple. He was tough, and he was in charge. Finally, 21 months after the fire, we were back. The new Apollo moonship was in Earth orbit and flying beautifully. Flying with Wally were two rookies, Walt Cunningham and Don Isley. To them, Wally was the old master.
Wally liked center stage, and the first Apollo flight was going to be center stage, and Wally's juices were flowing again.
The flight was going like clockwork. Then Mission Control wanted to change the flight plan. Experiments, little jobs that had nothing to do with flying. Just the kind of thing Wally always hated. He called them junk, and he had had enough.
They decided on a Saturday morning, we launched on a Friday, to turn on television. I was asleep and Don Isley was on watch. And I heard Don saying something about, Wally's not going to like that.
Roger, regarding the flight plan problem here, we would just ask to reconsider that.
And they said, well, the NASA PR guys want to have television today because they've got some quiet time. They can get national media. I said, sorry about that, guys. We're not ready yet.
We have a new vehicle up here. I'm saying at this point, TV will be delayed without any further discussion until after the rendezvous.
Roger, copy.
From then on, it was one thing after another. The first war in space, and the Russians weren't even involved.
Okay, Don, go ahead, Wally.
I've had it up here today, and from now on I'm going to be an onboard flight director for these updates. We're not going to accept any new games, like getting 50 feet to the Delta Z tower for a burn, or doing some crazy tests we've never heard of before. As a result, each test is going to be reviewed thoroughly before we act on it.
I was the flight director, the prime flight director, and I was on console at the time. And I was pissed off about it. That was an affront and inappropriate and frankly insubordinate.
Don and I would just, kind of look at each other and cringe inside at some of the exchanges that were going on. Keep in mind that, Wally had been around. This was his third mission, and he was kind of the cock of the walk, or at least he thought he was.
They were fighting like children, and I was in the middle. I'd never seen Wally so cranky before. But then Wally had never had a head cold in space before.
I've taken 2 aspirin, and I'm wondering if there's anything else I can take.
Roger. Wally, Houston here. Good doctors are recommending that you take 1 Actifed.
Hey, listen, let's go over this re-entry thing one more time since we got a little slack here and good communications. Let me tell you
one of the things I plan on doing after we break off the runs today is put on my suit and see how we stand. In the couch with the helmet off.
Roger.
The last straw was over the helmets, and it was a real battle. Mission rules said keep 'em on during re-entry. But with Wally's cold, he wanted to be able to hold his nose to clear the pressure in his ears.
In this case, I had a cold, and I felt that I had enough discussion with the ground. I didn't have much more time to talk about whether they're going to put the helmet on or off, leave the bubble helmet on or off. I said, essentially, I'm on board. I'm commanding. They could wear all the black armbands they wanted if I was lost or lost my hearing, but I had the responsibility for living through the mission.
Finally, Chris Kraft gave a direct order. Wear the helmet. Wally gave a direct answer. No way.
That's pure bullshit. I think Schirra was paranoid.
Why don't you say something nice about me?
Apollo 7 was the only flight of its type. It was the only time when, in flight, the flight crews were openly difficult to deal with and hostile towards some of the things that we were trying to do.
Paranoid and Jekyll Hyde might come out of all that, but I really wanted to do everything perfectly.
The flight was a complete success. and 10 days of bickering were finally over.
Deke took Wally into one of the rooms, and Wally and Deke had it out.
Wally and I had a little talk, but it didn't do much good. Before they'd even lifted off, Wally had announced it would be his last flight. He was beyond discipline. But Chris Kraft had to have discipline. Astronauts obey orders or they don't fly. So Walt and Don were the scapegoats.
I learned at one time that Chris Kraft had listened to all of this nonsense going back and forth from the ground to the spacecraft and said that he didn't want any of those guys ever flying for him again. Chris has denied that he ever said that.
I said the only way Cunningham will ever fly again is over my dead body. And he called me on the phone and asked me if that was the case, and I said, you got it straight from the horse's mouth.
The two other guys never did fly again. But Wally? Well, he went on to achieve a different kind of fame.
It's the nasal decongestant antihistamine tablet.
The great line, of course, where I got a Clio for that was, did you ever sneeze in one of these? And here's that same bubble helmet.
Can you imagine sneezing in one of these? I'm Wally Schirra. Suffering cold symptoms in space can't be fun.
It was only 3 weeks after my flight.
We still sit around and talk about it. How we devoted 8 years of our lives to the space program. Yet the moon seemed further away than ever.
Figured us old guys would be retired by then. These young guys could do it.
How'd you sneak back in there?
Yeah, very, very lucky to do it. It was the attitude everybody had.
But then all the work started to pay off. There was a change. Things started coming together. We knew the spacecraft could do its job. All we needed now was a rocket. The Saturn V. It would carry the spacecraft, the lunar lander, the crew, and everything they would need for a trip across 500,000 miles. 2 weeks in deep space. The biggest rocket ever made. It had to lift 50 tons straight in the air, not counting its own weight, and push it up to 24,000 miles an hour.
It was an unbelievable, tremendous creation. It was real. The Saturn V was alive. You know, you'd almost had to fall in love with that beast to feel comfortable riding on top of it. So I guess the thing that probably hit me more strongly than anything else was that I want to be on one of those things, and I kept thinking that was our outlet to the moon.
But it had never been tested, and nobody was going to ride it until it had. There were only 2 years left in Kennedy's decade. If this thing worked, we had a shot at the moon. If not, all the improvements we made to the brand new Apollo spacecraft wouldn't mean a damn thing. It was time to light the candle. It was the biggest rocket in the world. And finally, it was operational. It had been 10 years since Sputnik started the whole race. We hadn't heard from the Russians in a while, but after all our hard work and all our success, it was going to come right down to the wire.
We were told by Deke that the CIA had a indication that the Russians were going to try to circumnavigate the moon prior to the end of '68. And that was a driving force in, I think, one of the major considerations in the Apollo 8 decision. Well, for once, let's preempt them.
I think unconsciously that the fact that the Soviets were planning to put a man around the moon before the end of the year in their Zond spacecraft had some influence. Now, if you talk to some senior NASA officials at that time, they say, no, that had nothing to do with it.
The Russians had everything to do with it. We were coming into the last lap, and we'd be damned if we were going to lose this thing now. So the decision was made. Our very next flight, Apollo 8, would go all the way out to the moon.
Apollo 8 was the boldest decision we made in the space program, period, at any time. It was the cardinal step to landing men on the moon.
In 7 years of space flight, no one, not us, not the Russians, had ever gone beyond Earth orbit. This was the moon we were talking about. Deep space. A whole new ball game. 8 months of work done in 4. But this wasn't go fever. This time we really thought we could do it. Mission commander would be Frank Borman.
A lot of people got cold feet, and I had to keep reminding people, well, you designed this thing to go to the moon. Now we're ready to go to the moon, and you're gun shy. Why? It's ready or it's not ready.
Borman's crew included rookie Bill Anders and Jim Lovell, Frank's old Gemini sidekick.
Frank came back and told us, and so we were all elated. I thought that, yeah, this is the way to go. This is much better than going around the Earth for a second time with Frank Borman. I mean, I didn't think that was really necessary, but it was a much better flight to go to the moon with Frank.
But still, there was something about shooting the moon that made you think twice.
My wife, Susan, was convinced that we would not return from the moon, and she was, in her state of mind, was planning a memorial service without a body, and was really quite convinced that she would lose her husband on the Apollo 8 flight. But I didn't realize that she had these grave reservations, because if she would have exhibited reservations, I loved her deeply, and it would have made a big impact on how I approached. I'm not going to sit here and say I would have withdrawn, but I probably would have, I would have had a lot more anguish in trying to, instead of the gung-ho attitude that I had.
9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on.
We'd done everything we knew how to do. There was nothing left but to shoot the moon.
We have commit. We have the clock is running. 51 a.m. Standard Time. We have cleared the program. Roger. Ready here, Houston. Right, clear. Apollo 8, you are go for TLI, over. Roger, understand, we're go for TLI.
TLI, Translunar Injection, a command we'd never given before. It meant we were ready to send them out of Earth orbit, off into deep space, and toward the moon.
Apollo 8, Houston, you're looking good here, right down the center line. Roger, Apollo 8.
Approaching the moon, our blunt end was towards the moon, so we really didn't see the moon as it got bigger and bigger. The ground called up and said that at such and such a time, and they gave it right down to the second, we'll lose communication because the moon's gravity will pull you around to the far side. Exactly at the time that they said, right to the second, we did lose communication, had static in our earphones. We looked out though, but we could not see any moon.
We were upside down and backwards in perfect darkness.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit. There's a chair in this room. This is Apollo Control Houston, switching now to the voice of Jim Lovell.
Welcome from the moon, Houston.
Thank you.
The moon is a different thing to each one of us. I know my own impression is that it's a vast, lonely, forbidding type existence.
It was incredible. That was, to me, the one point in the mission where I thought, my God, what a team put us here. Here, we've gone 240,000 miles, and at the exact second we're supposed to see this, there it is. It was disbelief. Disbelief.
I think that we were like three school kids looking into a candy store window. Our noses were pressed against the window, and we looked at those ancient old craters as they slid on by, and forgot the flight plan for a while, and forgot really how dangerous this all was, because it was really something unique.
They didn't know it, but they hadn't seen anything yet.
Well, that moment was incredible when you looked and saw the Earth lying over the lunar horizon and realized that everything that we valued was back on the Earth, and it was the only thing in the whole universe that had any color. It was blue and white, and you could even see the kind of pinkish brown continents. That was more, to me, that was a greater impact than the moon.
Anders was in charge of photography, and he was taking pictures of the craters on the moon. Frank and I both saw the Earth come up and thought that it was a great time to take a picture of not only the Earth, but the lunar horizon in the foreground. So we mentioned that, but Bill said, hey, we only got so many frames of film, and we got to spend them, taking pictures of craters here on the moon. And then, of course, Bill looked up, and he saw what we were looking at, and he said, by gosh, we got to take a picture of that. All three of us, of course, grabbed cameras. All three of us took pictures. One of them, of course, became quite famous. I think it's known as Earthrise. It was made into a stamp in 1969. Now, if you travel and you run into Frank Borman, be sure to ask Frank who took the picture, because Frank will look at you and very seriously say, listen, I was the commander. Obviously, it's my photo. He even put it in his book that he wrote.
I don't know. Andrew says he did. I said I did. I don't know. I honestly don't know who took it.
Let me tell the truth. I really took the picture.
Lovell's the only one we know for sure didn't.
The pictures coming back from Apollo 8 made the whole world stop for a moment. I couldn't help but think how ironic it was. At the moment of our greatest success in space, America was coming apart.
We were so immersed in the mission. The terrible events of '68 didn't even leave a big impression on me. It was as if there was another world.
Mike, what I keep imagining is if I'm some lonely traveler from another planet, what do I think about the Earth from this altitude? Whether I think it'd be inhabited or not.
It was December 1968, and Christmas couldn't come too soon.
We were told, I guess maybe a month before the flight, that we were going to have this huge television audience from around the moon on Christmas Eve and to do something appropriate. To me, that was an annoyance. I didn't even want to take a television camera because I thought that would detract from the flight. As we got to the moment in the flight plan after we'd been viewing the Earth and the moon, we thought, my goodness, this is so appropriate, because we felt like we were looking at the beginning of a planet that hadn't really achieved life, and yet here in the background was the one that had.
For all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light.
I had an enormous feeling that there had to be a power greater than any of us, that there was a God, that there was indeed a beginning, and that maybe even our choosing to read from Genesis wasn't a haphazard thing, that maybe it had been ordained some way.
And from the crew luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
We all felt how far we'd come. It had been 10 years since we'd started. Gus would have been proud. He never did make it to the moon, but without him, we wouldn't have gotten this close when we did. We'd gone around the moon. All that was left was the landing. But that wasn't going to be easy. It was 8 years since Kennedy said we'd put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. With only 5 months to go, we were too busy getting ready for our first moonshot to worry much about the Russians. Then the CIA gave us a wake-up call we couldn't ignore. Satellite photos showed a monster rocket ready on the Soviet pad. It could only have one target, the moon. "24 hours later, the rocket was gone, blown up on the pad. Russians were out of the race, but their disaster, yet another reminder. This was the world's most dangerous business. Summer '69, but this isn't Woodstock. It's the moon launch at Cocoa Beach, and the world had come to watch. I was still grounded, running the astronaut office and doing everything but fly. Launch days were the worst. I felt like a damn babysitter. On July 16th, 1969, the routine was the same. Wake 'em up, feed 'em, stick 'em on the bus. Only this crew was going to the moon. It killed me. I could send anyone up there I wanted except for me and my buddy Al Shepard. The program had come a long way since Al became the first American in space, but he and I still had only 15 minutes of space time between us, and they were all his. Al's dizziness and my rough running heart meant we weren't going anywhere.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Good luck and Godspeed.
The liftoff went great, but we'd done those before. It was the landing we were worried about. That was no sure thing. But if 11 fails to land on the moon, 12 will do it, or 13. We were determined to get there before 1970.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are confirmed to go for orbit.
In mission control, I looked over at Al, and we both had the same thought. That should be me up there.
Obviously, I think every one of us wanted to land on the moon. That's what we were there for.
NASA could stop me from riding rockets, but they couldn't keep me from flying. Competition was always hot for space flights. But when I was selecting crews for the first moonshots, I had guys lining up to co-pilot my jet, impress me with their skills. But not that I'm suggesting for a minute they were kissing my ass.
Everybody knew who you had to impress, but it was hard to figure out how. It was dog eat dog.
There's no mystery about how I selected crews for the moon flights. I figured any one of these weenies would do a great job, so I put a list together of 18 and told them, one of you guys is going to be the first to walk on the moon. I don't know who, and I don't give a damn. You're all equally qualified. Of course, I knew one was better than the rest, but I couldn't go.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are go for TLI, over.
Roger. Ignition.
We confirm ignition, and the thrust is go.
Apollo 11, roger.
Houston, Apollo 11, that Saturn gave us a magnificent ride.
Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins. 3 men headed for the history books. But they weren't picked for their personalities or because they were any better than the rest. They just happened to end up at the right slot on the flight rotation.
Apollo 11, this is Houston.
Looks like it's going to be impossible to get away from the fact that you guys are dominating all the news back here in Earth. Even Pravda in Russia is headlining the mission and calls Neil the czar of the ship.
Neil, czar of the ship. Buzz loved that. He didn't like playing second fiddle to anyone. Tension between Neil and Buzz came to a head when Buzz tried to grab the brass ring, the first step on the moon.
I'm sure you don't wait until you get on the surface of the moon before you decide who steps out first. Being first on the moon obviously would be a landmark that everybody would remember because no one remembers the second guy. Do you remember the second guy to fly the Atlantic? So I, at one time, made the observation to Neil that I felt we needed a decision on this, and that one way or the other, regardless of how I felt or he felt, we needed to have a decision made on this. And his observation was something to the effect that he realized the historical significance and that he was not going to make a decision that would rule him out of that opportunity.
Buzz Aldrin made no secret about who he thought should be the first one to take that step on the moon.
We had always assumed Neil Armstrong, who was the spacecraft commander, was going to be the first man on the moon. We always felt like it was an unnecessary conflict that was created by Buzz, and kind of it created kind of a bad taste in other people's mouth about Buzz making this fuss about it.
Within a week or two, there was a decision made that Neil would be the first one. And being a military man and understanding seniority, that was perfectly all right with me.
It came down to tradition, and tradition says the commander always goes first. Besides, Neil was closest to the door. But we had much bigger problems to worry about than the first step. Like, could we even get them on the moon?
There were a lot of times when I'd come home from work and think, we just aren't going to get to the moon. We cannot make the lunar module light enough.
The lunar module, or LEM, we'd designed for the landing could only operate in the moon's gravity. So we couldn't even test fly this baby. Neil had to make do with practicing the landing in a mock-up nicknamed the Flying Bedstead. Morale hit an all-time low when the bedstead went out of control, and Armstrong ejected with only 1 second to spare.
11, this is Houston. You are go for LOI, over.
Roger. Go for LOI.
All your systems are looking good.
Everything looks okay up here.
Going around the corner, we'll see you on the other side, over.
Roger. Got them both. And go ahead.
Now, the actual descent, I called the team together and told them that, yeah, we had gone through a tough training period. We were really proud of these people here. We were about ready to sort of write into the history book that no matter what happened, good or bad, that day I was going to be with them. I was very proud of them, and let's go do it.
Okay, all flight controllers going around the horn, gonna go for undocking. Capcom, we're go for undocking.
Roger, Eagle, undock.
This was the first time we'd ever attempted a landing in the LEM. At least, when we were testing jets, we could eject. If this thing went down, Neil and Buzz were going down with it.
We'll monitor you, Delta 8. Beautiful.
You're go to continue power descent.
Okay, all flight controllers, gonna go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Rhino.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Econ.
Go.
Surgeon.
Houston, you're go for landing, over.
Roger, understand. Go for landing. 1201.
1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
1201 alarm. The automatic pilot was dead. They were way off course, with a boulder field for a landing strip. Neil was winging it, hunting around for a place to touch down. and they were low on gas.
Okay, we're go.
We're go. Same time. We're go. Into the ag, 47 degrees. Roger.
Well, we get to 1 minute fuel remaining, and you'll hear on the voice uplink, you'll hear a very trite 60 seconds.
60 seconds.
It was totally up to the crew from there on, and all you could do is Godspeed. You're sucking air, to put it bluntly.
Forward. 30 seconds. Forward.
By the time 30 seconds was called out, I knew that we were on the final descent. It just seemed like it was a long time. And without saying anything, I was just body English or whatever, trying to encourage Neil, bring it down, and let's get on the ground.
3.5 down, 9 forward. 5%. On any bite? 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust.
Come on, boys, put her down.
That's looking good, down 1/2. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. Contact light. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. We copy you down, Eagle. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
That's the first time he had opportunity to really sit down and say, hey, Christ, we really did.
This is Apollo Control Houston at 105 hours. Now into the flight to Apollo 11.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
Hey, Neil, we can see you coming. I'm going to step off the laminate. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar.
Flag up now. Beautiful, just beautiful.
Probably the crucial decision was made in May of 1961 when President Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon in this decade. If he hadn't done that, we might still be horsing around trying to get to the moon.
I always thought I should have had something profound to say that night to the troops, but the truth is I walked out, looked up at the moon, and thought, those are two lucky sons of bitches up there. I'll never forget that picture. The guys in that little damn quarantine doghouse and Nixon looking through the window like he might catch moon germs. Well, we'd won the race to the moon, and Neil Armstrong was the most famous man on Earth. But we weren't going to stop there. We had all these great plans for space stations, big moon bases, even trips to Mars. The one thing we hadn't figured on was the public losing interest.
Well, it makes you wonder whether or not we get our priorities in order, actually.
It's not worth it. No way in the world.
Why should they go up there when they have so many ghettos that should be cured? People are going hungry all over the United States, and they need jobs and everything else.
Down to the pad. Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
Apollo 12, the second landing. Already it was old hat, and the program was under question. That meant only one thing to astronauts. I might not get my ride. One guy was determined he would get his ride. Nothing was going to stop Al Shepard, not even the fact that he'd been grounded for 6 years.
I had tried everything that I knew of to figure out a way to cure the Meniere's syndrome. Just absolutely almost at my wit's end when one day Stafford came in and said, you know, Al, I've just been talking to a friend of mine who's involved in the ear business. He's with a clinic in Los Angeles. They've been experimenting with a surgical cure for many years. And I said, Tom, I am on my way.
Al didn't tell me he was having the operation. First I knew of it, he was knocking at my door saying he was good to go.
My first move, of course, was to head for a visit with my old friend Slayton. And obviously both of us knew that the next available mission, which had not been announced, was Apollo 13. So I said, Deke, that's the one I want. And Deke said, I think we can work it out. As I recall, the crew tentatively had been assigned for Apollo 13. I frankly don't remember who they were, but I'm sure they were qualified guys.
And disappointed.
And disappointed.
How in the hell did he pull that one off? But to get a flight like that, unreal. And here's Deke, who just had a minor fibrillation, no major problem, and here's Shepard on a command of a lunar mission. Well, he pulled it off.
He hadn't pulled it off quite yet. For the first time ever, the NASA brass rejected my crew selection.
Deke came to me and said, you know, Al's been grounded for some time, and we want to make sure that he gets plenty of training before he goes on this flight. And so why don't you take 13, and we'll give Al 14. And we were all happy until 2 days out.
We might give you a quick shot of our entertainment on board the spacecraft.
The whole world had watched the first lunar landing. Now we couldn't even get the networks to air this live TV show from Apollo 13. They ran soap operas instead.
Okay, Jim, it's been a real good TV show. We think we ought to conclude it from here now. What do you think? Roger, sounds good. And this is the crew of Apollo 13. Wish everybody there a nice evening. And hey, Houston, we've had a problem here. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem. Main B bus undervolt. Roger, main B undervolt. Stand by.
First an explosion, now they're losing all their power.
Flight, I've got a feeling we've lost 2 fuel cells. I hate to put it that way, but I don't know why we've lost them, and it's not an instrumentation problem.
O2 tank 1 is steadily decreasing.
We had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
It doesn't look good.
Of course, we didn't know what caused it. Didn't know whether it was a meteorite that hit someplace. And I looked up at Fred Hayes, who was in the lunar module at the time. I could tell from his expression he didn't know what caused it.
And it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space.
I looked out the left-hand window, and it dawned on me that this was oxygen. Didn't take much intelligence on my part to realize that. And that's when the old lead weight went down to the bottom of my stomach. It couldn't have happened at the worst time. 200,000 miles from Earth, and now we have an explosion and we're losing all of our oxygen.
We couldn't figure out what the hell had happened. We'd already proven we could handle emergencies. A failure here, a breakdown there, but this was different. Everything was failing at once. We called in every man we had.
When Kraft came in, I said, Chris, I think we're in a bunch of shit.
Here is a bulletin from ABC News. The Apollo 13 spacecraft has had a serious power supply malfunction.
At the moment, the astronauts are continuing to try to isolate their trouble. A late report says the spacecraft now is operating on battery power alone. All unnecessary equipment is being turned off.
I want you to get some guys figuring out minimum power in the LEM to sustain life. We figure we've got about 15 minutes worth of power left in the command module, so we want you to start getting over in the LEM and getting some power on that.
The spacecraft would be dead in 15 minutes. The crew needed a lifeboat, and the only thing that came close was the lunar module.
And about the time they finally called up and said, we think you got a real problem, that you might have to use the lunar module as a lifeboat. Well, Fred and I were already climbing through the tunnel going back into the lunar module.
I'd say this is as serious a situation as we have ever had in manned spaceflight. If at any time in the mission, however, the LEM had separated and we had gotten ourselves into a rendezvous situation or the command module being around the moon, then what you state is absolutely true. It would be a fatal situation.
And that was probably the toughest, undoubtedly the toughest press conference I've ever been to, where I knew the wives and the kids of the guys who were up there and who were close friends of mine, and I wasn't really convinced we were going to get them back. It really didn't look very good at the moment.
Now the media was covering the story. The third moon mission might not preempt regular TV, but a disaster in space would. The spacecraft didn't have the power to turn around. We'd have to use lunar gravity to whip them back to Earth.
They might have had in the back of their mind, it'd be much better for that crew to come back and hit the Earth in some manner. Not so much that it was survivable, but rather than have us as a monument to the space program that would whip around the Earth for infinity.
We were racing against time. The lunar module was keeping the guys alive, but it was never designed for a long trip.
Fred Haise determined how much oxygen we had in the lunar module, how long the batteries would last, how much water we had on the lunar module, not just to drink, but also we had to use it to cool all of our electronic systems, otherwise they would fail.
When Deke asked me first, will we have enough power? And I told him very honestly, Deke, I don't think so.
And it turned out that we would run out of electrical power and water long before we could get home.
We had to get them home sooner. That meant speeding up the spacecraft. But they only had enough power for one attempt at this critical burn.
And just as we were approaching the moon, the ground had called up and said, yeah, we think these procedures will work. Are you ready to copy? And I said, yes. And I looked over at my companions and I said, gentlemen, what are your plans here? And they said, Jim, if we go around the far side of the moon, we're going to take some pictures. And I said, if we don't get home, you won't get them developed.
Okay, look, let's get the camera squared away and get all set for the burn. We got one chance, pals.
Jim, you go for the burn. Go for the burn. Roger, understand. Go for the burn.
Guidance, good line. Control, okay?
Go.
Go, Capcom. Pinko, do you have the Omni for the burn attitude?
We're burning 40%.
West Houston, you're looking good.
Shut down.
Roger, shut down.
I say that was a good burn.
At this point, I wanted to get the crew some rest. They'd been awake for days.
I feel we've gone a hell of a long time without any sleep. We're going to have to start thinking about getting people back to sleep again because I didn't get any sleep last night at all.
You couldn't sleep. I mean, it was just a cold, clammy. Everything was getting wet. All the windows were perspiring. The metal was very cold to the touch. It seemed to sap out any heat out of your body when you touched it.
I developed a prostate urinary infection and had the most severe chills and fever that I'd ever had, and at times couldn't stop shaking. And we were trapped in this vehicle.
It was amazing the amount of isolation we had in the spacecraft and not realizing the impact of our crises had back on Earth. You know, we knew we were in trouble. We talked to Houston, but they never relayed back, you know, that the whole world was glued to their TV sets.
It was time for re-entry. The crew was down to their last few ounces of water. It had been the longest 6 days of our lives. Now they had to leave the lifeboat and land the crippled spacecraft. We'd overcome obstacle after obstacle, but it wasn't over yet. We jettisoned the service module, and then we saw it. The huge hole left by the explosion.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. The whole panel is blown out. A lot of debris is just hanging out to the side.
An explosion that could tear a hole that big could have damaged the heat shield. Without that shield, they'd burn alive. No one said anything to the crew. Nobody had to.
Let's get it. Okay, copy that. Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
The lifeboat was gone. The crew was back in the crippled command module with a dicey heat shield and only enough battery power for re-entry. All we could do was cross our fingers.
Hang in there, it won't be long.
Okay, LOS in a minute or a minute and a half. An entry attitude we'd like Omni Charlie.
And if there's a time when you died 1,000 deaths, it was wading through that period of time when it was just up to the crew and the good work that you'd done before. And there was no more help you could, nothing you could do. I mean, you were helpless.
Odyssey Houston standing by, over.
And then finally there's that vast relief where you just finally see the spacecraft on TV, you see the chutes blossom out.
And your chutes look good.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Apollo 13, this is recovery, over.
Another chair in the control room as we head to splashdown.
This one here, it was really a combination of absolute exhilaration and total exhaustion. But it was just to the point, and then yeah, I just cried when it was all over.
My interest in aviation goes all the way back to Lindbergh. I was a young boy when he flew. Of course, he immediately became a national hero. He became certainly a hero of mine.
Al Shepard was selected to carry the national image on our first flight in space after we'd been shot down by Gagarin. Then it was fitting that after Apollo 13, Al Shepard is the commander of the mission that is going to restore the confidence in the space program.
The retread and the two rookies. That's what Al, Stu Roosa, and Ed Mitchell were known as. There was a whole lot of bitching in the ranks that Al picked two guys with no flight experience to go to the moon.
Everybody thought we were the three rookies. And in all of my private conversations with Stu and Ed, it was, fellas, we're going to land closer, we're going to bring back the best rocks, we're going to fly the best goddamn lunar mission that's ever been flown.
No one ever fought harder to get a flight assignment than Al Shepard. And no one ever worked harder to get ready than this old Project Mercury veteran and his two rookies.
He and I walked out and looked at his Saturn V, 38 stories high, all lit by spotlights. And I've often related that moment to a time 10 years previous when I was a young lieutenant getting up at 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning to watch this guy named Alan Shepard jump on top of a rocket and blast off into space. And here I was 10 years later standing next to that same man. He was going to go to the moon the next morning. You know, how many people can say that?
After years of frustration from watching others take their trip into space, Shepard was finally getting his chance. America's first man in space was going to the moon.
20 seconds, the guidance system now going internal. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence start. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff from Apollo 14. The tower is clear. 3 minutes past the hour.
Shepard reports roll program completed. Pitch profile still in progress.
Okay, we're 1 Bravo.
Status check in mission control. Coming up all greens on the flight director's console.
In Houston, everything looks good here on the ground. Apollo 14, Houston. Here, go for the moon, go for TLI. Right here, go for TLI.
Al had his ride, but after Apollo 13, we weren't taking anything for granted. And sure enough, we had problems from the get-go.
The first major function on the flight, of course, was to dock with the lunar module and be on our way.
Houston, we're about to dock.
He hit that thing dead center, bounced right back out with no capture.
Okay, Houston, we did it twice.
If they couldn't dock, they'd be coming right back home. The space program didn't need another failure.
I thought that maybe I didn't hit it hard enough.
Sure looks like we're closing fast enough. I'm going to back out here and try it again.
You do have a go for another try.
Tried it again.
I hit it fairly hard on that next try. Ed made the comment, said, hey, let's don't run through it.
Well, we better back off here and think about this one, Houston.
That, of course, initially says, hey, you can't go to the moon.
Al had waited too long to let a broken latch stand in his way.
We were so target-oriented that we began thinking about all possible ways to correct the docking problem. And one obvious way which occurred to me immediately was the fact that we could do it manually.
Al proposed to Houston that we put on our suits and depressurize the command module, and he would go outside and pull the two together. This would have been something totally unpracticed, pretty much on the on the cutting edge of a risky operation, to say the least.
Of course, the immediate reaction on the ground was, well, that guy Shepard really wants to get there, doesn't he?
We suggest you come in hard and fast and retract the arrow immediately.
Roger, Ed. We got a very good picture.
We got some, Houston.
I believe I got a hard dock, Houston.
That's a hard dock.
Roger, Al. That's great. Super job. Okay, Al, everything looks good down here, and you have a go for LOI.
Hey, Pluto, we sure picked a clear day to arrive. There's not much haze in the air at all.
Incredible.
This is really a wild place up here.
Wheels down and Al would be there. All he had to do was land. But this would be the toughest landing yet, even for a carrier pilot. The site was a mountainous region with peaks 10,000 feet high. Just as Al started down, he lost the thing he needed most. The landing radar was dead.
And we kept getting lower and lower and closer to 13,000 feet, and still no landing radar.
There was no way we were going to let Al go down without radar. And if he didn't get it working by 13,000 feet, mission rules said he had to abort.
After all this effort, all this time, we're almost there, and we've got a serious problem here.
As Al got closer to 13,000 feet, I started getting nervous. My old buddy just might disobey that order.
Apollo 14, Apollo 14, this is Houston.
The ground rules are sometimes made upon arbitrary decisions. Maybe one could have gone to a lower altitude before deciding to abort. Maybe one could have gone down to the point actually where one could pitch over and actually view the lunar surface. And of course, if one does that, then hypothetically, one is able to make a safe landing.
He was not going to abort. He's going to land.
Finally, some bright young man in the control center realized, from looking at his indications, that the radar was in fact on, but it was locked up on infinity. So he said, well, let's turn it off and let it recycle, and I think it might work.
And Terry's Houston would like you to cycle the landing radar breaker.
Cycle.
Okay, I would like to accept the radar.
Board radar.
Oh, great.
And then Terry's Houston, your go for Palmaro.
So 90 feet, 4 feet per second, 5 feet per second now. Okay, down, looking great.
60 seconds.
Okay, 50 feet down, 50 feet.
In good shape, too.
50 feet per second, 40 feet, 3 feet per second, 30, 3 feet per second, looking great. 20 feet, 10, 3 feet per second, contact now. That was a beautiful one.
Close, but other than that, we're in great shape. Yep. Right on the landing site.
And Mitchell turned to me and said, Al, what were you going to do if the landing radar wasn't working by 13,000 feet? I looked at him and I said, Ed, you'll never know.
Okay, Al, beautiful. We can see you coming down the ladder right now. It looks like you're about on the bottom step and on the surface. Bedford, old man.
Okay, you're right. And it's been a long way, but we're here.
So one of us had made it at least. And while I couldn't be in Al's shoes as he stood there on the moon, I understood better than anyone what it meant for him to be there.
It had been a long build-up to finally reach the point where I was able to stand on the surface of the moon. It was an emotional moment for me. It was a sense of personal triumph, personal satisfaction. In a few moments of maybe patting myself on the back before it became obvious that we had to get back on schedule and get on with the job.
Take a look at Palmaro. Take a look at Cone Crater, I should say. And it's a very impressive sight. Okay, what do you think's a good spot for the LSEP?
Soil here is a bit firmer, I think.
Almost 2 hours now, is that right, Fred?
I don't know if Al came back with the best rocks, but he certainly came back with plenty of them. The mission had been a success, but Al wasn't quite done. There was one parting moonshot he wanted to make.
Okay, Houston. In my left hand, I have a little white pellet that's familiar to millions of Americans.
Drop it down. We're going to try a little sand trap shot here.
That looked like a slice to me, Al.
Miles and miles and miles.
Maybe Al Shepard will tell us for the first time what the brand of that golf ball was he hit on the moon.
Nice try, John.
But I think the real thing is the truth of how far it went. We get all different stories on that.
Crew of Antares is leaving from our base.
Roger, Al. Yeah. You and Ed did a great job. And with this closeout, Al Shepard, now at age 27 years, becomes the undisputed leader in time spent working on the moon.
3, 2, 1. We have ignition.
What a liftoff.
And liftoff.
Roger, ignition.
When we left the moon, and that's such a beautiful sight where you're coming up off the moon and you're going so fast. I mean, it is so beautiful. And I said, Al, have you got something prophetic to say? And he looked over at me and he said, Stu, you know me better than that. And that's typical Al.
One of the moments which I shall never forget occurred 3 weeks after the return from the moon. My father and I were just having a little brandy in the living room. And out of the blue, he said, do you remember when you first called us back in 1959 and said you were going to become an astronaut? I said, yes, sir. And he said, do you remember what I said? I said, yes, sir, I certainly do. You were not in favor of it. And he raised his glass and said, I was wrong. That's all he had to say.
Apollo 17, the final moonshot. Not even Al Shepard could turn the tide of public opinion. His mission had been a success, but America had turned its back on the moon. Apollo missions 18, 19, and 20 were canceled.
17, Houston, you are go for orbit.
We knew that Apollo 17 was the end of Apollo. The press would never forget it. They kept saying, how does it feel to be the tail of the dog, or how does it feel to be part of the end? And, you know, guys were losing their jobs as a result of Apollo. As soon as we lifted off, all the Grumman crew got their pink slips.
There was a feeling of profound disappointment that the program was ending. Of course, I was disappointed that I didn't get the chance to go to the moon, but more than that, we'd put together this tremendous team and technology. To stop it now just didn't make any sense.
Historians will look back on this program and wonder why the United States, at the height of its technological achievement, just quit.
Sure, I knew that I would be the last man of Apollo to walk on the moon, and it might be as long as 10 or 15 or 20 years. But truly, when I left the surface, I believed then, and I believe now, someone will be back someday.
May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind.
Those were the last official words spoken on the moon.
Now, the unofficial words are about 10 seconds before Jack Schmitt and I lifted off, and I just looked over at Jack and I said, Jack, let's get this mother out of here.
Proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector grid.
I remember when I called George Lowe and told him I was leaving the program, he wrote me a very nice letter, and in that letter he said, there'll never be another Apollo in anybody's life. And I thought maybe that says it all.
But the story's not over yet. There's one chapter left to be told, and it's mine. I always knew they were wrong about my heart, that one day I'd be able to say, Deke Slayton, astronaut. I knew I could have flown any one of those missions, but the docs got fixated on the fact that once in a while my heart skipped a beat. Then as suddenly as it started, the problem stopped. I had a bad cold and started taking vitamins by the handful. Then it hit me. My heart hadn't missed a beat in months. Of course, it wasn't easy convincing the NASA docs that vitamins could cure a heart fibrillation.
We knew more about Deke Slayton's heart than any person we ever flew. And that goddamn doctor stood up in the meeting and said, well, we know we've said that before, but if he fibrillates on the pad, we want to stop the count. And I fired that son of a bitch.
When Deke was able to finally get approval to fly again, I was just so delighted for him, so happy. And I thought, well, this guy really wants to fly. He's even going to learn how to speak Russian so he can fly in space.
Boris,
all of us wanted to be first at something. Maybe there was some poetic justice there in Deke's case, that he got to make the first joint mission with the Soviets.
Talk about a Hollywood ending. My ride came right out of a movie, Marooned. It portrayed the Russians as the good guys, saving 2 American astronauts stranded in space. This movie helped convince both countries that a joint mission was possible, even during the Cold War.
I want to be a movie star.
Alexei Leonov, cosmonaut, and my buddy. He was one of the guys we'd been competing against in the race to the moon. Now we were on the same team, training together, doing our bit to thaw out the Cold War. Here I am at another pre-launch breakfast. Only this time, I'm not sitting on the sidelines. Finally, it's my turn.
Good morning again. Jim Hartz and Alan Shepard from the Mission Control Center in Houston, Texas.
At that time, we were very close, having worked together in an administrative capacity over the years when neither one of us could fly. And to finally see my buddy get a chance to give it a go really meant a great deal to me.
5, 4, 3, 2, engine sequence start. 1, 0, launch commit. We have a liftoff. All engines building up thrust. Moving out. Clear the tower.
Roger, power clear. Roger, Tom, you got good thrust on all engines. You're right on the money.
Roger.
Dan, this is Worthwaite, 16 years 4.
Apollo Houston, you're go for station.
Roger, go for station.
The launch. I loved it. Damn, I'd like to do one of those every day. Didn't get a whole lot of time to cogitate, but I couldn't help feeling a little sad that this was the last time an Apollo spacecraft would soar into space. And of course, I thought about Gus.
Apollo Houston, I got 2 messages for you. Moscow is go for docking. Houston is go for docking. It's up to you guys. Have fun.
All righty, sounds good. Follow me now, meet Alexei.
3 meters. 1 meter. Contact. Capture.
Got it? Here.
If you'd have told me way back when that one day we'd be shaking hands with the Russians in space, I think I'd have told you to go see one of my doctor friends at NASA. The irony is, we needed the Russians all along. If we hadn't had them sitting out there, we might never have even tried to shoot the moon. It's like all American endeavors. We've got to have a competitor.
All philosophers say the best part of a good dinner is not what you eat, but with whom you eat.
Let me call to express my very great admiration for your hard work, your total dedication in preparing for this first joint flight.
Deke, you've had a very, very long record of distinguished service preparing other astronaut crews for various space missions. And we're extremely pleased to see you on the crew of the first international manned space flight. As the world's oldest space rookie, do you have any advice for young people who hope to fly on future space missions?
Well, yes, I have a lot of advice for young people, but I guess probably one of the most important bits is to, number one, decide what you really want to do, and then secondly, never give up until you've done it.
In the beginning, we didn't share a dream. We shared a drive to be the best. Farther, faster, higher. The creed we lived and died by. But who could have known it would take us so far?
I feel so fortunate that I happen to be around at a time after hundreds of thousands of years when people, whether they moved out of a cave or not, and looked up and looked at the stars and things and wondered, what's up there? And we haven't gone very far yet. We're a tiny little distance off the Earth. But how lucky we are to have been around and to have been able to take part in some of those first little steps.
We were test pilots at the right time, right place. We were rivals, friends, fellow travelers, some of the luckiest men who ever lived.
Deke Slayton, astronaut, died of cancer in 1993 during the making of this series. His heart was strong until the end. Six hours after his death, Deke's racing plane was spotted taking off from a California airport. Not only had Deke died hours before, but that same plane, that same time, was in a Nevada museum. As Deke always said, no matter what happens, keep the dream alive.
Godspeed and good tailwinds, buddy.